or desiring, and for all Alex said, there may well be no such experience of believing or of desiring. Instead, there's this quite different kind of model that proceeds from just the fact of one's believing and one's desiring, and taking knowledge of that as a taking one's believing, desiring as a starting point, engaging in a certain inferential pattern, forming the belief that one's believing or desiring. Alex argues that in the case of belief, this is a strongly self-verifying pattern of inference, and therefore can yield knowledge. And in the case of desire, it's at least a pretty well strongly self-verifying, quasi self-verifying. What's it? Reliably self-verifying process that can also yield knowledge. Now, my worry, Sidney can also be seen as doing something analogous with memory of the self. Memory of the self is grounded. Sidney accepts a Humean point that there's no experience of the self. Memory of the self is grounded in something other than experience of the self, something outside consciousness, namely causal connections outside consciousness. And it may well be. I think Jesse and John didn't really discuss the transparency challenge explicitly, but you could see part of what John was doing is giving a model for how beliefs about the self can be grounded in something other than experience of the self, maybe grounded in some kind of functional connection to action. And Jesse didn't talk about concepts of the self, but I take it he believes in them, so there'll be a question: how do you get concepts of the self without experiences of the self? Well, I take it they'll have to be grounded in something else. Now, my own inclinations to reject and prefer experiential models to non-experiential models. I guess that might just be because I'm a consciousness-first kind of guy. You want to put, I think experience really plays a very, very central role in our mental lives. I've got leanings towards certain kinds of foundationalism, that our knowledge of everything is grounded in certain forms of experience. But also, I think when it comes to some of these models, you get prima facie questions that render them problematic. One issue that comes up a lot from models like Alex's, for example, is, okay, it's one thing for processes like this to yield you a highly reliable belief-forming process, one that can't go wrong. It's another thing for them to yield justification for the resulting beliefs, or reasons for the resulting beliefs. I think that was a theme that Fred brought up in the discussion period after his talk. From my perspective, it's, at least if you're any kind of internalist about justification, thinks that justifying features ought to be internally accessible to the subject, it's not at all clear how this gives you that kind of internalist justification. I know that Aaron Zimmerman, who's here somewhere, has thought about this topic and even has a special symbol for it, which maybe he'll demonstrate for us in discussion. So I think there are serious epistemological issues for this kind of non-experiential optional. I think one of the really interesting things that's happened in the last few years has been the investigation of non-experiential models. But my own inclination, as I've said, lies towards experiential models, something which really didn't get a lot of direct exploration in this conference, although it's come up in discussion quite a lot. So the third strategy is to deny premise one and say that we do, in fact, have experiences of ourselves and of our mental states. Furthermore, these experiences can ground, play a really central role in grounding our self-knowledge and indeed our self-concepts, our self-beliefs, our self-memories, and so on. So we have some experiential awareness of the self, we have some experiential awareness of our mental states, and these play a central role in grounding our introspective self-knowledge. So that's really the option I want to pursue in the remainder of the talk. I'll say a little bit about experience of the self before moving on to experience of mental properties for reasons that I hope will become clear. One question which came up in and after Jesse's talk is, it's not totally clear what it is to deny. It's not totally clear what the claim that there's experience of the self comes to. And it's not totally clear what it is to deny it. One way to put this is to think in terms of the contents of experience as what you're aware of in experience. I'm aware of blueness, I'm aware of there being a white rectangular sign over there. So the contents of my experience involve white and rectangular and so on. So one question is, does I enter into the contents of experience? You might think, well, that's just what it comes to. The question is their experience of the self. Well, I think the answer to that question is very plausibly yes. It's actually not even something which Jesse denied. I can experience this surface as being in front of me, for example. I can experience you guys as being oriented in a certain position, right now mostly to my right. I can experience this body as being my body, and so on. I think this is all very plausibly part of the content of my experience. I'm aware of this body as being my body. I'm aware of you guys as being out in front of me. So there is an essential use of this first-person notion in expressing the contents of experience. I think actually this occurrence of I in the context of experience is already enough to ground a lot of self-knowledge. I mean, if I experience a green piece of paper as being in front of me, and if I then use that to form a belief, I could then gain knowledge of the fact that I am such that I'm a being who's such that there is a green piece of paper in front of them. That's a bit of self-knowledge. Okay, maybe it's not the interesting form of self-knowledge. Perhaps, of course, the interesting form of self-knowledge is knowledge of one's mental states. So this is what Jesse called experience of the self as subject. And in particular, I take it that means subject of mental states. Maybe subject of closely related things such as actions, too. Someone who performs actions. So this, well, by the analogous model, by the model analogous to experiencing the table as being in front of me, this would need something like experiencing oneself as being in mental states. Having experience of myself as thinking, having experience of myself as feeling or seeing or acting, and so on. So in a way, this kind of comes down to the issue about experience of mental states. It requires settling that first. I mean, Fred, of course, is skeptical about whether there is this kind of experiential awareness of one's mental states. It came up in the discussion period after Jesse's talk that he himself may lean in Fred's direction. So I think if you start from skepticism about the experience of mental states, if you're inclined to deny that we have experiential awareness of our mental states, then there's a much quicker conclusion, a much quicker route to Hume's conclusion that doesn't need to go through a whole lot of phenomenology and cognitive science and so on. It just looks like, experience of self as subject would require experience of oneself as subject of mental states by definition, no experience of mental states, therefore no experience of self as subject of those mental states. That would be a much quicker route to the conclusion. In any case, it looks like to address this question, you really need to first address the question about transparency of mental states and whether we have some awareness in experience of our mental states. So that's what I'll turn to for the most part. Now, this thesis of transparency is a really vexed thing. It gets discussed in hundreds of different ways in the literature. Someone's going to write the definitive review paper where all 243 formulations of transparency are compared and contrasted, and then we'll do a component analysis on it and come up with 7 or 8 fundamental dimensions. And so on. I've stated a particularly strong version of a thesis here because it looks like the one that might be required to do the relevant kind of work. I mean, one version of the thesis is something like the following. In experience, one is aware of the non-mental contents of one's experiences, one's mental states, but one's never aware directly of the mental states, or at least one's not aware of them in virtue of having them, or something like that. In any case, it's clearest, I think, with examples. In visual experience, the transparency claim will say, the transparency claim about visual experience will say something like, okay, when one has visual experience, one's experientially aware of colors, of shapes, maybe of objects, external objects, and their properties, but one's not aware of such things as seeing those colors or visually experiencing those shapes, and so on. And indeed, the strong version of the thesis will say one's never aware of such things in experience. In the case of conscious thought, which Fred focused on, the claim will be something like, in consciously thinking that P, consciously thinking